All right, good morning, everyone. It is 10:30 and we are ready to begin our press event, which,
Heather, we're not live on Facebook yet, so you just need to give me 1 minute if that's okay.
all right,
Sorry about that.
that's okay, Molly. Let me know when you're ready to go, and thanks everybody for being patient.
All right, we are live on Facebook.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Heather Dubois-Bournon, and I am Executive Director of Wisconsin Public Education Network. You are joining us today for a virtual press event that marks Wisconsin's last opportunity to speak up on the 2021 to 2023 biennial budget, the most important piece of legislation that our lawmakers pass every 2 years. Lawmakers have had 3 in-person hearings of the Joint Committee on Finance, and today they're holding their final in-person face-to-face hearing virtually, and 200 lucky souls who got into the lineup when it filled up within 20 minutes last week will be testifying today online. You can follow their testimony all day on Wisconsin Eye. But we wanted to give an opportunity to folks who maybe hadn't been heard through this process, or who didn't get one of those coveted slots, or who couldn't travel miles and miles from their home to testify at one of the remotely held in-person hearings today. We at Wisconsin Public Education Network have been partnering with our friends at the ACLU of Wisconsin to attend all of the in-person hearings, and today's press event will give a summary of what we've heard, as well as an opportunity for some of our partners to share the concerns that they feel Wisconsin needs to prioritize when they consider the budget. May I see the next slide, please? Our agenda today will include brief remarks from our invited speakers, followed by any questions that the press might have for those speakers. Then we're going to open things up to others who are joining us today as participants in case they would like to share their own budget concerns or remarks. Panelists will remain muted while they're speaking, please. And we ask that members of the media identify themselves and distinguish themselves from other participants by listing the name of the organization they represent after their name so that we know when to call on you. Finally, participants who wish to be heard during the open mic part, you don't have to share your entire budget testimony, but if you could share perhaps why the budget is important to you, what your priority concerns might be, and what you'd like others to know about why it's important to speak out on this process, please just raise your hand when prompted during the Q&A using the little raise hand button on the bottom of your screen, and we will call on you accordingly. So speaking today are me, Heather Dubois-Bournon of the Wisconsin Public Education Network. I'll be followed by the Executive Director of the ACLU of Wisconsin, Chris Ott. And if she's able to join us, Helen Marks-Dick of the AARP of Wisconsin. Raya El-Hajar, who's a Montessori student at Maryland Montessori and Milwaukee Public Schools, is in school today, but she sent us a video testimony that she'd like us to share with you. And then Kim Kokel, who is Executive Director of the Wisconsin Rural School Alliance and a member of the Board of Directors of the Wisconsin Alliance for Excellent Schools, which oversees the work of Wisconsin Public Education Network. Followed by Peggy West, who is Southeast organizer for Expo, Ex-Incarcerated People Organizing, which had a strong presence at the in-person budget hearings. And then Paul Vang of the Hmong American Women's Association. Closing up our event will be Deborah Cronmiller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. I'll come back at the very end to kind of wrap things up, and then we'll take questions from the media. We're here today to call on Wisconsinites to speak up and be heard in these final 3 days when you have opportunity to lift your voice on the state budget. To submit your official budget testimony, you can follow the QR code that you see on the screen here, or you can email your remarks to budget.comments@legis.wisconsin.gov, or follow online. Visit our websites, wisconsonnetwork.org or ACLU-WI.org, for more information on how to testify and talking points. But here's what we know about the state budget. Over 479 people have already testified in person. About 200 more will be heard today. That's 679 people potentially out of the 5.59 million approximately who live in our state, whose official testimony has already been registered in person. If we want to make our voices heard on the state budget, we need to lift up our voices and submit our testimony. You can overview the budget documents by following the links that are provided to you here, and learn more about what's in this important document and why it matters to the folks in your community, and call on lawmakers to invest in a budget that puts priority needs first and really closes the gaps for Wisconsin students and communities. We've invited some of our speakers here today to share some of their concerns about how this budget can do that, and their concerns about the budget process. So I'm going to pass the mic now to Chris Ott, Executive Director of the ACLU of Wisconsin, and we will ask all of our speakers to unmute and follow in order after the speaker before them is done. I will not be introducing each person individually. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. Growing up in Wisconsin taught me the importance of using money carefully, not spending it if you don't have to, and spending it wisely if you do. And I think that we have a really important chance in front of us now to put those values into practice. The Wisconsin state budget determines how we will spend millions of taxpayer dollars over the next 2 years, but it also does much more than that. It represents our collective values and gives a blueprint for shared goals. We each need to engage in this process to encourage elected officials to make decisions that will help Wisconsin become a better place for everybody to live. The ACLU and our allies here today and throughout the state want to make the case for constructive criminal justice reforms in our state budget. Those include legalizing cannabis, promoting police accountability, investing in substance abuse and mental health treatment and diversion programs, raising the age of adult criminal prosecution to 18, and closing the infamous Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake youth prisons, as well as the Green Bay Correctional Facility. We've joined with organizations like the Wisconsin Public Education Network to show how the expansion of mass incarceration has siphoned investment from public schools, and also to show the pervasive racial disparities in both of those systems. Despite the decision to hold this year's in-person hearings in locations far from where most people live in Wisconsin, people have still turned out with a clear message. Our state budget should invest in healing and divest from harm. We've already heard powerful testimony from people at the hearings held in Whitewater, Rhinelander, and Menominee, who said that our current system desperately needs to change. Doctors, psychologists, and people struggling with substance abuse have shared personal stories about the addiction crisis and how that's impacted their lives. Formerly incarcerated people not only shared testimony, but helped to lead the charge, testifying that the expansion of access to quality treatment instead of incarceration provides a much better answer. People sentenced as adults for crimes they committed as 17-year-olds have opened up about traumatic events that they experienced in adult correctional settings, highlighting the need to treat youth differently in our legal system. And people from all walks of life have traveled around the state to demand that our racist and ineffective system of mass incarceration be dismantled. We've heard from educators, principals, deans, school superintendents, and school staff from all over the state who shared the need to allocate more resources to Wisconsin's public schools and to ensure that all Wisconsin students, regardless of race, disability, and background, have the same opportunities to thrive. We really hope that members of the state's Joint Finance Committee will listen to this message that our budget needs to provide resources that reflect the goals and values of all the communities that it serves. Thank you.
At Maryland Montessori School. I'm going to start by acknowledging the fact that I'm probably not the right person to be giving this speech. I'm not a special ed student, I'm not an ESL student, nor do I go to a school with a significant amount of either. My parents are both teachers, and my school is far more privileged than many schools in MPS. I'm also old enough to understand that not everyone gets the opportunities that I am given, and that shouldn't be the case. Lack of funding should not be the reason that schools cannot offer special ed or ESL services. Those services are essential. We need to close the education gaps in our city and state. People always talk about closing the gaps, but it's very rare to see leaders or a budget that make good on that promise. I encourage you to be the exception. Prove that we can trust our elected leaders. Governor Evers' budget showed priority for special ed and ESL students, transparency, and plans to close the educational gap in our state. I hope these priorities are maintained in the final budget that you approve. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you to WPN for hosting this opportunity today. My name is Kim Kokel. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Rural Schools Alliance, and we represent over 166 rural schools throughout the state of Wisconsin and their communities that they are in. Because of the difficulty that many of our schools are facing with the pandemic this year, many of our superintendents were unable to make it to the few hearings that there were and just did not have that opportunity. Many have submitted testimony written, and I'm here today just to kind of give a quick overview of what our organization supports for our rural districts. As an organization, we support the governor's budget proposal for K12 education, and we feel the proposal has numerous items that both sides of the aisle already agree upon. Support of these budget items are another step in the right direction to adequately fund the needs of our students. Each year, we survey our members on the budget items that they feel are key to them. And these are the items that we have kind of brought to the forefront for this budget cycle. Fair funding. And it's not just fair funding, but it's support for both an increase in general aid and per pupil cost. If we don't do both, we have winners and losers. Secondly, special ed funding. We support the governor's proposal to get special ed funding to 50% funding. Many of our districts right now, even with the increase in the last budget, are still having to borrow, transfer large amounts of money from Fund 10 to their Fund 27 to make up for a deficit in that funding. Next, mental health and health services funding. The pandemic has really brought a light to this. Many of our school districts don't have school nurses and have been trying to figure out ways to work their way through the pandemic and the things that need to be done. Many of our rural districts were face-to-face and have done a very good job with social distancing and masking. But we also know coming out of this, we're going to have a lot of mental health issues, both for students and staff. Broadband and infrastructure expansion are key in this budget. And we also know there's going to be federal funding for that. And we feel that that's a very important thing. Broadband should no longer be a luxury item. It should be a service that everybody has availability to. And as we found out in this pandemic, many of our folks don't, and we need to make sure that last mile is covered. And finally, support for the governor's sparsity aid proposal. We've had sparsity aid on the books for a number of years now, but it's only been for districts that are under 745 students. We support the governor's proposal to continue to support those districts that are at 745 or less with $400 per student. But we also have been asking for the last 2 budget cycles, and the governor has put it in the budget, that we provide $100 per student for any district that meet the sparsity formula that are over the enrollment of 746 students. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Good morning. My name is Peggy Westschroeder, and I am the Southeast Wisconsin campaign coordinator for Wisdom Expo through the ROCK campaign, which is Restore Our Communities. Wisdom and Expo stand with the ACLU in calling out the Joint Finance Committee leadership on the lack of virtual options for Wisconsinites wishing to be heard virtually. Holding in-person hearings during a pandemic should not have been a consideration. It is irresponsible. The poor turnout compared to past years should have been an indication that more virtual hearings should be added. Instead, the one virtual hearing that is to be held, registration was closed within 20 minutes of the registration beginning. We believe a thorough review of Wisconsin open meetings law is in order to assure that those laws were followed in these hearings. Wisdom Expo have grave concerns about the locations and times of these hearings as well. Working Wisconsinites were not allowed participation in the public hearings as the times required people working for a shift to take off. Students were disenfranchised from these hearings. The hearings in all three places were over before most working people got off of work. Governor Evers proposed promising criminal justice reform endeavors, yet many of our members could not speak in favor of them because they were obligated to be at work. This seems intentional. Last, once the virtual hearings were opened, the voices of our members were silenced again when the rule was passed that only 2 speakers could register from any one organization. This violates our freedom of speech. No accommodations were made to extend speaking times to those 2 representatives. The Joint Finance Committee leadership should have been more transparent if they simply did not wish to hear from large sections of our state and their populations, including the economic engine of our state, Milwaukee. Thank you again to the ACLU for bringing this injustice to light and allowing us to stand with you in your request for more virtual options to hear from the fine tax-paying citizens of Wisconsin. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Vang. I'm a former high school chemistry teacher, as well as a current community organizer with the Hmong American Women Association. We're a culturally specific direct service and advocacy organization led by Southeast Asian women, queer and trans leaders that work to keep victims and survivors safe in the city of Milwaukee. A little known fact is that Wisconsin, and more specifically Milwaukee, is home to the largest Myanmar refugee population in the country. And this includes ethnic minority groups such as the Rohingya, the Karen, and the Chin. And these are the very same communities that we work with and work to keep safe throughout the city. And so from our work on the ground and with community partners, over the past year, we have seen a sharp spike in domestic violence and sexual assault, particularly murder-suicides of Hmong and Southeast Asian women across the country, as well as a wave of violence against women of color, including the shooting of 6 Asian women in Atlanta back in February. With this in mind, in order to better serve women and families in our Hmong and Southeast Asian communities, we believe the state must invest in the following, which includes supporting the work of culturally specific organizations that have the creative solutions to address the needs of those who are most impacted in their communities and who are also the most trusted in their communities as well. At a time in which the federal government is decreasing funding for domestic violence services, such as the Victims of Crime Act and the Violence Against Women's Act, we believe that state government has a responsibility to increase funding for these services at the same time. We know that as an organization that serves women survivors, that access to emergency housing makes the difference between life and death. And so we believe that part of the state budget needs to go towards funding more affordable housing and emergency housing for women and family survivors. Along with that, free to low cost culturally specific health services that include mental health services and basic health care screenings, which I know are part of the governor's plan to increase healthcare access, especially for impacted and underserved communities, and of course, affordable childcare during this time as well. And then lastly, As a former educator myself, I know that many of our refugee students in our public schools are underserved by the current English language learner capabilities at their local public schools. At my old school that I had taught, there was only one English language learner teacher for over 100 refugee students. Along with the young people that we work with at the Hmong American Women's Association, we often hear from our young people that they don't feel included and that they don't feel accepted within their schools. And so we recognize and applaud the governor for his 28 million increase in investment for English language learner funding that will go towards our refugee and English language learner and immigrant students here in the city of Milwaukee. So thank you very much.
Good morning. This is Deborah Cronmiller. I'm the Executive Director for the League of Women Voters. I too want to thank WPEN and ACLU for allowing us to all have this opportunity to speak with you. The League for 101 years has been advocating good government practices, open government practices, practices that allow citizens to have their voices heard in how we are governed and how our budgets reflect our values. And we think this is a critical moment in time for all citizens to make their voices heard. The League was lucky enough to get one of the 200 slots today, and we will be able to present testimony later this afternoon to the Joint Finance Committee. And what we will tell the Joint Finance Committee is that we believe in voting rights. We will let them know that it is imperative that our maps, district maps coming after the census, are drawn transparently and in a nonpartisan way so that all citizens can be heard throughout Wisconsin, and our elected officials will feel more compelled to actually represent the constituents in their district versus the donors and parties that they represent. We, of course, will be advocating for broadband, as their partners on this telephone call have already expressed. Emerging from the pandemic, we are seeing the great disparities that have occurred in our systems, and broadband is one of those great disparities affecting education, affecting businesses to be able to thrive in all areas of the state. It is critical that we make this an essential service and not just a service for those who can afford it. Of course, we will be speaking in support of much stronger funding for public education. This afternoon, I will ask Joint Finance to ensure the special education reimbursement rate of 60% is indeed maintained in the budget. We have a strong position on criminal justice and juvenile justice, and we too will be advocating for all 17-year-olds to be adjudicated in juvenile court and not in adult court. We have strong positions on natural resources and the environment, and we will be asking the Joint Finance Committee to ensure that communities have access to resources to research and determine if they have contamination of PFAS and how to remediate that contamination if it exists in the water in their communities. We will also be asking in our larger statement to Joint Finance that all systems of water that are clean and free and accessible. We have for too long seen the deterioration of water systems in our major metros. In Milwaukee, for instance, there's a very serious problem with lead pipes and infrastructure, and these need to be repaired, and we need to allocate infrastructure funding to ensure that that gets done. We'll of course be asking the legislature to double their financial commitment of operational revenues for the focus on energy program. Businesses, households should be able to reduce their expenses by conserving energy, and Focus on Energy is a program that helps us do that. And then finally, we will be seeking from Joint Finance a strong commitment to public health and healthcare coverage for all, with the expansion of Medicaid to over 91,000 new uninsured citizens in Wisconsin. That's the extent of what we will be asking for. I'll share our complete areas of priority in the chat. Tomorrow, the League of Women Voters will be part of a national day of action around people-powered fair maps. Making our voices heard to our legislators, as we're doing here and as we will be doing tomorrow, is critical to let them know that we are listening, we are watching, and we want to be represented. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts and concerns today. Your comments reflect much of what we heard when we traveled the state with our partners at the ACLU of Wisconsin and listened to people in person testifying for the values and the needs of their communities. The testimony that we heard at those hearings was overwhelmingly in favor of the proposals put forward in the governor's budget. Over 60 organizations called onto the Joint Finance Committee to hold more virtual hearings, to hold more public hearings on this state budget when the first and only virtual hearing filled up so quickly, and that request was ignored. That doesn't mean we need to be silenced. There are opportunities to speak up and be heard by submitting our testimony on this super important document in writing. And your deadline for doing that is Friday, April 30. I want to acknowledge that one of our speakers today, Helen Marks-Dix of the AARP of Wisconsin, was unable to join us because one of her members had one of the virtual spots and needed her assistance. But I know that she planned to echo some of the other concerns that we heard here today, calls for Medicaid expansion and rural broadband. I also want to emphasize that the absence of Helen from this event today is not unlike the absence of Helen and the AARP folks from the in-person budget hearings that we saw as we went around the state. Normally that group has a very strong physical presence at those, and they, like many other groups, were really absent from the conversation as their members didn't feel comfortable testifying in person or couldn't make the long trip to the locations to do so. It is our job as people who care about investing in thriving communities to make sure that the priority needs of our communities are known. And it is our lawmakers' jobs to pass a budget that makes sure that that happens and that turns those priority needs into realities for our kids in our schools. The governor's budget does this for education, and not in a partisan way, but in a way that reflects the concerns that have been put before this body in the past and the proposals that were put forward by the nonpartisan Blue Ribbon Commission on School Funding that have yet to be achieved by our legislature. It's time to close the gaps that have been created through past budgets and that have made it challenging for children to thrive in our public schools, for communities to thrive, and for individuals to have the resources that they need to be successful in the lives they want to live in this state. Let's come together for a budget that works for Wisconsin. Speak up, be heard, amplify your voice, and make sure that your budget concerns are heard today. This concludes the formal part of our press conference. We will now take a moment to answer questions, if there are any, from members of the media, and then open up the mic to those who are participating today who may have budget concerns of their own that they wish to share. So I will pause and see if we have any hands raised to ask questions. Give you a second to navigate that. You can use the raise hand feature if you do have a question. All right, seeing none, I'd like to kick off the open mic portion of these proceedings by queuing up our friend and member of the Milwaukee Public Schools Board of Directors, Megan O'Halloran.
Thank you, Heather. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me.
We can hear you, Megan, but if you want your video on, I think you've got it off yet.
Oh, I don't know how to do that from my end, unfortunately. But I can just do this. I don't want to take up any more valuable time. unless somebody can help me. Okay, it's all good. So serving on an underfunded district feels like we're constantly trying to keep the rain from our students' heads by running from funding gap to plug the holes. My first budget cycle was challenging, but nothing could have
That was my bad. I just accidentally kicked Megan out of the Zoom, but I'm sure she'll be back.
Oh, so sorry about that, Megan. Molly, I believe we also had somebody queued up who submitted video testimony. Maybe we should play that while Megan's
Megan's back.
And oh, she's back already. That was quick.
Peggy's got me. Thank you, Peggy.
Oh, hey, look at that.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Nice to see you, Megan.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as I was saying, just serving an underfunded district feels like we're constantly trying to keep the rain from our students' heads by running from funding gap to plug holes. And my first budget cycle was challenging, but nothing could have prepared me for this 100-year storm that is COVID. It has highlighted every area that inequitable funding formulas have forced us to neglect over the years. We're educating 21st century students in 19th century buildings. We have a minimum of $200 million of deferred maintenance, and to bring my students' schools up to the quality of their peers just a few miles away would take up to $1 billion more. And I would love to do that for my students, but we're just running up this gap to fill other gaps in our budget. So my ask to the Joint Committee on Finance is to help me help my students by finally taking action on the special education funding gap. Every year, districts around this state spend $1 billion of their operating funds fulfilling the state mandate and moral obligation to provide special education services. The result is that school boards have to make these painful decisions. So maybe we run up deferred maintenance. Maybe we increase class sizes. One of my principals said he could reduce class sizes from 29 to 21 with adequate special education services. So maybe we do both of these and we take other measures. Closing the gap would improve the educational experience for every student in public schools. And I want to make one other point, and then I'll pass the mic. A few years ago, a family member suffered a very serious staph infection and was hospitalized for many weeks. At that time, my children were small. I was working full-time, traveling across the state to be with my loved one. I was making their medical decisions, paying their bills, worrying about their kids, and then every night just worrying that I could lose my loved one. And I remember feeling in that moment that a few days in the hospital sounded kind of nice. And in hindsight, I know that that was really unhealthy thinking, and that most people would choose to not have to be hospitalized. I was overwhelmed, but it was such a privilege to be able to be of service to my family in their time of need, because taking care of each other in our time of need is what family does. And I bring this up because I've heard some people worry that Milwaukee Public Schools is going to get too much relief aid from the federal government. And from where I sit, not getting more money seems like a good problem to have. We are getting this aid because approximately 85% of our students live in poverty. I would be grateful to get a smaller relief package if it meant that we had fewer children coming to our schools hungry. I think most people would choose that option. So rather than worry how to spend poor children's dollars, I asked the Joint Committee on Finance to do their jobs and close the special education funding gap that punishes not just my student, but every student in this state. Thank you to everybody for giving me this opportunity to register my testimony.
Thanks so much, Megan. We really appreciate you sharing those thoughts. I know one of your fellow board members got a slot in today's hearing, but other than that, I don't think we had heard much from folks from Milwaukee throughout this process. So we appreciate being able to lift up Milwaukee voices at this event and really urge others to take note that if you want your community's needs to be heard, it's really on you to speak up and make sure that your lawmakers know that. Share your comments, not just with members of Joint Finance, but also with your own legislator too, so that they know you spoke up. Every legislator in Wisconsin votes on this budget, and so our voices really matter. Molly, I believe we have another video that was shared with us by somebody who couldn't join us today. Can we cue that one up?
Good afternoon. My name is Shang Elizabeth Lohr, and I'm an Eau Claire County social worker for a psychosocial rehabilitation program called Comprehensive Community Services, also known as CCS. CCS is a program that helps individuals of all ages live their best life by providing supports that address their unique needs relating to mental health and substance use. CCS is intended to assist individuals who are in need of care outside of an inpatient setting, but who may have ongoing needs that, if left unaddressed, could result in hospitalizations during times of crisis. As of December 31st, 2020, the latest data available is that nearly 11,000 individuals, or 10,078 to be exact, were enrolled in our program throughout the state of Wisconsin. One of the many passions I have is and will always be rooted in the expansion of mental health affordability and accessibility for all people, but specifically for the vulnerable populations like the individuals I have the pleasure of serving. I myself have experienced trauma that has had lingering and long-term effects on my mental health, and without the counseling I was able to receive, I know I would not be where I am today. Mental health is real and it is debilitating. If someone like me, who has extensive resources and support systems, is facing mental health challenges because of my traumas, I can't imagine what it would be like for someone else who does not have the same access to address their emotional needs. Although our wraparound program is a newer program, the problems we help our clients face are not new. I ask that the Joint Finance Committee revisit policies relating to the mental health accessibility and affordability, reviewing specific allocations of funds for programs like CCS. Realizing the complexities that intersect with equity, diversity, and inclusion, poverty, trauma-informed care, and community resources readily available to those in need, I ask that Joint Finance Committee supports wraparound, client-focused, strengths-based voluntary programs such as CCS, as well as any other DHS programs that serve thousands of people every day. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. At Wisconsin Public Education Network, we have received so many videos like that, or copies of people's written testimony that they submitted to the legislature because they couldn't attend the in-person hearings or they didn't get a slot in the virtual one. We urge you to lift up your voice and be one of them. Thank you for taking time to join us today and to help us in our efforts to make sure that every single person in Wisconsin knows that they only have until Friday to get their budget testimony in, and that it's actually super easy to do so. You don't have to be a budget expert. You don't have to be a policy wonk. You don't have to understand the finer details of this massive document to know that an investment in the priority needs of our kids, our communities, and our state is required if we want to live in the kind of state that we want to live in. The Wisconsin we deserve is just a budget away, and we can make moral choices through this important piece of legislation that really guarantee all of us equal opportunity to thrive. Why can't we do it? Call on lawmakers to do so and make sure that you share with them the needs that you think should be most central to their decision making. Go to wisconsonnetwork.org or ACLU-WI.org to learn more about what's in the budget and what you can do to make your voice heard. Thank you to all of our panelists and all who participated in today's press event for joining us. And please do your part in speaking up and making sure the voices of others are heard on this budget this year. Thank you, everyone.